The first time George Patton was chewed out by General Rockenbach, the words the general used were nothing you'd use to describe a soldier. He said that Patton didn't fight like an officer at all. He charged straight into the gunfire like a dog in heat, deaf to every order coming from behind him. And as the single most valuable man in America's first tank force, he was running around on foot at the front like a wild dog that had broken its chain. While Rockenbach tore into Patton, he also threatened to send him before a military tribunal, something that could have ended Patton's military career right there on the spot. 2 weeks later, on a fog-shrouded road in the Argonne, Patton pulled the same trick. He left without permission, ignored the very same orders again, and walked into an even more dangerous position, and this time it very nearly cost him his life. It was this very instinct, condemned by his commander as a disgrace, that on that same morning earned Patton the second highest medal for valor the Army could bestow. The military actually issued both a letter of reprimand and a citation for commendation over exactly the same conduct. If you think stories like this are worth hearing, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on the little bell. We've got a lot more good material on the way. Your support is what keeps us moving forward. By the end of 1917, on the list of cavalry captains waiting for promotion, George Patton stood in the 113th spot. There were 112 men ranked ahead of him. John Pershing, the commander-in-chief of the American Expeditionary Forces, reached past every one of those men and handed Patton a job no American had ever taken on before, to build the nation's first tank force from scratch, from absolutely nothing. Calling it starting with nothing is no exaggeration. There were no tanks. There was no armor school. There were no operating manuals, and there wasn't a single man in the American Army who had ever fought inside one of these machines. Patton, with his one and only lieutenant, arrived at Bourg in eastern France and set about building a fighting force out of thin air. He talked the French into lending their Renault tanks, and then he drove them himself, test-fired the guns, and walked the assembly line to study closely how these things were put together. On that foundation, Patton wrote the operating manual, the very document that would teach every American tank officer who came after him how to use this weapon. He trained the crews and set the discipline. When America's first tank brigade rolled toward its first fight, it was moving by a standard one man had written by hand. This was a trap closing shut, though Patton hadn't noticed it yet. For the simple reason that he had built the entire force single-handedly, this officer became the one man the force could least afford to lose. Every extra hour Patton spent at the exposed front was another hour the whole American tank program hung in danger, one bullet away from being beheaded. Value and danger met in the very same man. For most of the soldiers on the Western Front that autumn, fear ran in only one direction, the fear of being killed before the war ended. Patton's fear ran the exact opposite way. What he was afraid of was that the war would end before he ever got to fight in it. The German collapse was plain to the naked eye, deepening month by month. Peace was no longer some far-off fantasy. But to Patton, peace arriving early wasn't relief, it was robbery. It would shut the one door he needed, keeping him from the glory he'd dreamed of since he was a boy. A man who fears death lowers his head and takes cover. A man who fears the war ending does the exact opposite. He charges into the fight, because what he's really running from is the silence that comes afterward. The only thing standing between Patton and the front line was one regulation and the man who enforced it. Samuel Rockenbach commanded the Tank Corps, and he held to one principle above all others, that a brigade commander must direct the fight from the command post. The commander had to stay by the field telephone, gather intelligence, and move dozens of machines through other men's hands over the telephone lines. To Rockenbach, this wasn't caution, it was the whole logic of command. A brigade's operations couldn't be run by a colonel curled up in a shell crater 400 meters forward, where he could see one tank and knew nothing about the other 70. A commander's eyes were worth far more fixed on the map than fixed on the muzzle of a gun. Patton understood the regulation. Half the military doctrine that laid it down, he'd written himself. And the same Patton who had built the armor school and trained the crews knew in his heart that Rockenbach was right. But to Patton, the front line was the only place where a soldier's worth showed itself. Rockenbach's regulation was like a wall thrown up across his path. a wall built by a superior Patton couldn't get around, keeping him out of the real battle he'd spent a year preparing to reach. By the second week of September 1918, that wall and the hunger inside Patton were about to collide violently. American forces were massing at a place called Saint-Mihiel, getting ready to launch their first large-scale offensive as an independent army, and Patton's tanks would be in the fight. The window Patton had always feared would slam shut had finally swung open. And yet every order Patton received told him he could only sit behind the telephone and watch that window from far away. In the 5 hours before dawn on the 12th of September, 1918, Allied artillery pounded the Saint-Mihiel salient, a bulge the Germans had held for 4 years, 25 miles wide and 15 miles deep, wedged into the Allied line east of Verdun. When the guns fell silent, the first independent American army of the war pushed toward it. Somewhere in the wet dark behind the leading infantry, Patton's Renault tanks rumbled toward their first day of battle. Patton had a command post, and he had an order to stay inside it. For the first hour of the fight, Patton obeyed both. The situation at the front came back over the field telephone. Tanks bogged deep in the mud with their bellies stuck. Tanks running out ahead of the infantry they were supposed to cover. Tanks broken down from engine failure or run dry of fuel. Patton listened to every report by the telephone line, moving these machines with his voice through the hands of the men around the command post, doing exactly what Rockenbach had ordered. By 7 in the morning, Patton could no longer sit still by the telephone. The battle he had spent a year preparing for was happening somewhere on the other side of the ridge line, and all he could do was hear about it secondhand over a wire. Patton handed the receiver to an aide, told him to keep taking the reports, and then walked out of the command post on foot, heading toward the sound of the guns. What Patton saw along the way was exactly the war he'd craved since he was a boy. On a small hill outside the village of Essy, with German shells still bursting on the slope, Patton ran into another officer standing out in the open, refusing to take cover, Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded a brigade of the 42nd Rainbow Division. The meeting was brief. These two men, both dead certain that a leader must never flinch, stood shoulder to shoulder in the barrage for a few minutes, and then each went back to his own battle. Coming down off that hill, Patton walked into the village of Essy, still partly held by German troops, walking ahead of his own tanks into the streets. Then Patton climbed onto the deck of a moving Renault tank and rode it forward into the next village, Pans, sitting out in the open atop the machine until German machine gun fire finally drove him down off the tank and flat into the dirt. The commander of America's entire tank force, in the deciding moments of its very first battle, was wandering on foot through forward villages or riding on tank decks where a single rifle bullet could have finished off the whole tank force for good. The battle itself was a success, and the tanks deserved plenty of the credit. By the time the salient was pinched out, the Americans had taken more than 16,000 German prisoners and captured more than 400 guns. Of the roughly 174 tanks Patton sent into the fight, only a handful were completely destroyed. Most of the losses came from the mud and mechanical failure, not from German fire. 5 of Patton's tank crewmen were killed and 19 were wounded. These machines, dismissed by many senior officers as slow, fragile novelties, had just proven they could break through solid defenses and survive. By any ordinary measure, Patton's own conduct under fire was brave to the point of recklessness. Rockenbach didn't use ordinary measures. To Rockenbach, the outcome on the battlefield couldn't paper over one fact, that at the decisive moment of the attack, the officer responsible for every American tank had gone missing. He'd left the telephone line, dropped out of contact, gone wandering on foot through the forward villages, while another 70 tanks fought blind with no commander. A brigade commanded from a shell crater was the same as being commanded by a man who could see one tank and knew nothing about the rest. Patton's whole way of commanding rested on the idea that the commander must hold the big picture, and Patton had thrown that whole picture away in the first hour of the fight. Rockenbach didn't wait for a written report. He ordered Patton straight to the command post and tore into him with that special fury of a man watching his most valuable officer treat orders like a game. In Rockenbach's telling, Patton hadn't been commanding at all at Saint-Mihiel. He'd simply broken loose. the most precious man in the tank corps, in the deciding moments of his first battle, had been running around forward villages like a dog off its chain, chasing the rumble of the guns, while the 70 tanks he was supposed to command fought blind. A brigade commanded from a shell crater was the same as being commanded by a man who could see one tank and was deaf to all the others. Rockenbach told Patton to his face plainly that this was not the mark of a fighter. This was exactly the mark of an officer who couldn't be trusted, who wasn't worthy of the position his rank had given him. Afterward, Rockenbach set these reprimands down in cold, specific words, so that no one could mistake them for a mere flash of temper. 3 points in all. Tanks had to fight in platoons of 5, and were never to be split up. A brigade commander throughout the entire operation had to remain at Corps headquarters or keep in close telephone contact with it. From now on, anyone who abandoned his vehicle to fight on foot would face trial. That last point carried the weight of a court-martial, and its aim was pointed less at some nameless crewman than at the bad habit the brigade commander Rockenbach had just witnessed was setting for the whole unit. In the plain words that everyone in the room could understand, this was aimed straight at Patton. Patton knew perfectly well what he had done. 4 days later, in a letter to Beatrice, Patton admitted that Rockenbach had chewed him out hard for going up to the front. But then, right after that, he told her in the letter that it was something that simply had to be done, that he would never hunker down in a dugout while his soldiers were out there fighting and bleeding. Patton had no confusion about the rules. It's just that in Patton's mind, whenever the rules and that conviction were weighed against each other on the scales, the second always outweighed the rules. The very same 40 minutes at the front were entered into 2 completely different sets of books. In Rockenbach's ledger, it marked a commander who had left his post without leave and endangered the entire project. In the ledger of the tank crews, that same 40 minutes marked exactly why these men were willing to follow Patton through fire and water. One of Patton's officers, a Captain Viner, later put this side of it bluntly. Patton was always up at the front, never tucked away safely in the rear, and to Viner, this was precisely one of the secrets of his greatness. On any form in the United States Army, there was no space set aside for a quality like this. It was at once a flaw that deserved punishment and the very source of a commander's power. Rockenbach filed it as failure. The soldiers filed it as devotion. It was exactly the same act, and it would remain forever unsolvable, because both readings, by their own standards, were correct. Rockenbach believed that a written reprimand plus the shadow of a court-martial would settle the matter. He figured a man as smart as Patton, once he saw the rules in black and white and faced the threat of losing everything, would surely stay put next time. Rockenbach judged Patton's intelligence correctly, but he misjudged what governed Patton. The force that had pulled Patton away from the telephone at Saint-Mihiel was not some lapse of reason that a stern letter could correct. It sat closer to the core of the man than reason did. In less than 2 weeks, on another battlefield, in an even thicker fog, Rockenbach would discover this. The last German strongpoint in the Saint-Mihiel salient had only just fallen when the whole center of gravity of the American forces began shifting toward a new sector to the northwest. The High Command gave itself 10 days to move hundreds of thousands of soldiers, their artillery, and their supplies onto that tangled stretch of ground between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest, and to prepare to launch an attack from there on the 26th of September. Patton's tank units would be in the fight again, this time to support 2 divisions of the 1st Corps. And Patton, far from letting his freshly bloodied troops rest, had already come out to this new position with his maps to scout the terrain on foot himself. What Patton saw was bad. The ground ahead was even worse tank country than Saint-Mihiel. The surface was rough and broken, thick with trees, cut across by a river, and that river ran right between the 2 divisions Patton was supposed to support, which would make it impossible for the tanks of either division to go and help the other. A commander who wanted to understand that terrain could never do it from a command post miles away. Patton went and looked at it himself, and this was the same instinct that had already earned him a written reprimand, only now dressed up in the clothes of diligence. Hanging over that instinct was something heavier than a scolding. Rockenbach's reprimand after the Saint-Mihiel battle was not the end of the matter. Rockenbach turned the third of those points into an active order for the coming fight. Anyone who voluntarily left his tank to fight on foot would face a court-martial. On its surface, this threat was aimed at ordinary soldiers, but Patton was the man in the whole unit who most flagrantly left his post and went forward on foot, and Patton knew exactly who this order was really written for. The price of doing again what Patton had done at Essey and Pan's was no longer a cold letter. It could be the end of the career Patton had built from nothing, and this was happening on the eve of what might be the last great war his career would ever see. The first wall was high. The second wall stood inside Patton, and it was worse because Patton couldn't help but agree with it. Patton had drafted the very military doctrine that placed a commander beside the maps. Patton knew as well as Rockenbach that a brigade couldn't be commanded from a shell hole, that a colonel walking forward on foot could see only one tank while going deaf to the other 70, and that the eyes which had built this force were worth more gathering the whole picture than chasing one fragment of it. Every professional judgment Patton possessed lined up with the very order he longed to break. The wall keeping Patton in the rear wasn't just Rockenbach's. It was Patton's own trained mind, standing in the same spot as that threat, telling Patton the same thing. So there were two walls, both pointing the same way. Stay at your post. A rational man who wanted to save his career, with a court-martial on one side and his own doctrine on the other, would stay put. What Patton did in the 10 days before the battle showed exactly how little those two walls weighed against the thing behind them. Patton had not resolved to stay in the rear. Patton set about building a way to push forward, a way those two walls couldn't fully reach. Rockenbach's order required a commander to stay in close contact with the fight, so Patton increased the number of runners in the brigade from 6 to 10. More men to carry messages by hand, which on paper meant tighter communication, but in practice meant Patton could leave the fixed telephone and still claim he was keeping in contact. Patton also loaded the tanks with extra fuel, strapping 20-liter cans of gasoline to the rear decks so the machines could travel farther before running dry. Dangerous. This was openly dangerous. Cans full of fuel sitting exposed on a tank's back. But Patton judged the risk worth taking. Every preparation Patton made was a preparation to go farther forward and stay there longer than the last battle had allowed. Here the deadlock showed its true shape. A threat doesn't reach down into a man's core and erase what he wants. A threat only raises the price of that want. Rockenbach had raised the price to the highest limit an officer could bear, and the effect on Patton wasn't to kill his impulse, but to make Patton more resourceful in satisfying it. More runners, more fuel, a personal reconnaissance that could be called duty, a whole apparatus quietly designed so that his craving to charge toward the front could be satisfied under a name Rockenbach couldn't immediately punish. Discipline hadn't freed Patton from that compulsion. Discipline had only made the compulsion smarter. The extra runners were where the giveaway lay. A man who intended to obey orders didn't need 4 more messengers. A man who stayed at his post had his telephone. Those runners existed for only one reason, so that when Patton left his post again, there'd be a chain of men passing word back and forth, and Patton could point at that chain and say the order to keep in contact had been obeyed. The letter of Rockenbach's rule was satisfied precisely in order to break its spirit. Patton did not intend to rush forward recklessly and openly defy the order the way he had at Saint-Mihiel. Patton was building a mechanism to defy it responsibly. None of this was on the map Rockenbach was reading. Rockenbach believed the reprimand and the court-martial order had done their work, that a warned and intelligent officer would now command from the place a commander was supposed to be. Rockenbach had missed the point. The question had never been whether Patton understood the rule. Patton had helped draft it. The question was whether understanding a rule could stop a man for whom the forbidden thing was rooted deeper than his understanding. In those 10 days, everything Patton arranged had already answered that question, to anyone able to read it, before a single tank had even moved. On the night of the 25th of September, the American guns opened fire along the Meuse-Argonne line, hundreds of guns pouring a barrage into the darkness to the north. The fog came down with it, thick and wet, and it lingered a long time. Somewhere behind the jump-off line, Patton's tanks waited in the fog, extra fuel strapped to their decks, and Patton waited too, together with his runners, 4 of whom had been added for a reason Patton hadn't said out loud. The window Patton had feared would close forever had opened again. Every wall built to hold Patton in the rear was still standing. By morning, Patton would walk straight through them. At 5:30 on the morning of the 26th, the barrage that had pounded northward all night began to lift and creep forward, and Patton's tanks rolled slowly off the jump-off line into a fog so thick the crews couldn't even see the machine right in front of them. Patton and his 10 runners stood at the assembly point, watching the tanks vanish into the gray fog after rolling only a few yards. For a short time, the mechanism Patton had built over the past 10 days did exactly what it was meant to do. Word came back by runner, and Patton sent orders forward by runner, and through it Patton could tell himself he was keeping in contact with a battle he couldn't see. But the heavy fog quickly shattered that fictional illusion. The runners sent out into the murk went out and never came back, or came back carrying reports that were already an hour behind, describing front lines that had already shifted. The tanks pushed along the valley road toward Cheppy, and then they simply vanished. Patton stood at his post receiving nothing at all, and the battle he was commanding was slipping forward into the thick fog ahead, second by second, sliding out of his control. That written reprimand had meant to restrain every instinct in him, and in an instant, every one of them was set ablaze. Patton left the starting point and went forward on foot along the Cléry-Neuville-Boureuil road, following the churned track marks his own tanks had pressed into the mud, walking straight into the zone Rockenbach had expressly forbidden him to enter. The court-martial order Rockenbach had handed down was, in that moment, the clearest thing in Patton's world, and also the thing Patton cared about least. 10 days of quiet planning, the extra runners, the fuel, the reconnaissance that could be called duty, all of it came down to that single act it had always been meant to earn permission to do. In worse terrain and thicker fog, Patton once again did the very thing that unfailingly brought reprimand down on him. This whole machinery of responsible disobedience had, at best, carried Patton only through the first hour of the fighting, once the fighting was real. The impulse took over, and the machinery was thrown aside. Up ahead, the tanks had stopped completely, and the reason they had stopped was the terrain. Huge German trenches cut clean across the line of advance near Cheppy, and their width made it impossible for the Renault tanks to dip their noses down and climb back out, so the machines were crowded up along the near edge of the trench with nowhere to go, engines idling, while machine gun fire swept down from above hunting for them. A tank stalled out in the open with no cover is not a weapon. It is a sitting target waiting for someone to come and move it. The lead element of Patton's entire brigade had stopped moving and had begun to sit quietly and die in place in front of a ditch in the earth. A little way up the road, the fog thinned out just enough for Patton to see his tanks, and the Germans spotted that same gap. Artillery came crashing down across the road, and machine guns opened up from the heights to the north, sweeping the open ground where Patton and the men with him were pinned. Patton ordered everyone down. The group scrambled off the road and took cover in a nearby railroad cut, a shallow ditch of leveled earth that could shield them from the fire pouring down off the ridge. In that cut, Patton rode out the heaviest of the shelling, pressed against the dirt bank with his runners and stray soldiers, and as the commander of the entire American tank force, he was stuck fast in a ditch a mile from where that commander was supposed to be. That railroad cut did not stay a refuge for long. As the German fire kept up, more and more men began to flee into it. Not Patton's tankers, but American infantry, falling back through the fog from the stalled attack up ahead, crowding into that same cut looking for the same cover. They were leaderless, panicked, and their numbers kept growing, and every one of them was moving in the wrong direction. Patton had gone forward looking for his tanks. But what Patton found was a front line beginning to fall apart, a swelling crowd of frightened soldiers gathering in a hole in the ground, while the attack that was supposed to carry them forward had died a few hundred yards away. This raises a question worth thinking about, because the historical record answers it in an ugly way. Every single reason Patton was there in that cut was a breach of discipline. Patton was there because he had left his post, ignored his orders, defied the threat of court-martial, and walked into a zone a brigade commander had no business setting foot in. And precisely because of that, Patton became the one senior officer present at the exact spot where the American attack was collapsing, the only man with the rank and the will to act on a route that no one sitting in a proper command post could even see. It was this very act of disobedience, one that put the whole project at risk, that placed Patton exactly where the project most needed a commander to appear. That fault and that usefulness once again showed up in the same act, and this time the stakes were no longer a letter, but a battle coming apart in the fog. Patton could feel the attack dissolving all around him. The tanks were stuck in front of the trench up ahead, stuck on terrain the machines could not cross. The infantry were pouring back into the cut he was in. In a few more minutes, this position would no longer be a firing line, but a mob. What Patton did next would decide whether the men in that hole charged forward as soldiers or stayed in it as deserters, and the man who had to make that decision was now a full mile past the place his own orders assigned him, with no command authority over most of the troops now looking up at him, brought there entirely by the very compulsion Rockenbach had spent 2 battles trying to break. Patton stood up out of the trench. The first thing Patton did was not a tactical arrangement. It was forced recruitment by the sheer force of his presence. Patton walked into the crowd packed into the ditch, his own runners, strangers from scattered infantry units, anyone holding a rifle, and began to gather them together into a formation that would only go forward and not back. Some of them went willingly. Some did not, and for the ones who wouldn't go, Patton drove them. The record clearly sets down one moment. Patton struck a reluctant soldier on the head with a shovel, forcing the man up and forward. In that instant, the commander of the American tank force was less a general than an angry sergeant with a shovel, piecing together an assault force out of the wreckage of someone else's failed attack. The tanks were still the key, and the tanks were still stuck in front of the German trench. Nothing up ahead could move until the machines got across, and the machines couldn't get across without a path cut through the earthen bank on the near side of the trench, so the Renaults could climb down and up the far side. That work had to be done by hand, with shovels, in the open, under machine gun fire pouring down off the ridge. Patton sent men to do it, and while they dug, he did not stand behind them. Patton stepped up onto the trench line where the digging was going on, fully exposed to the German gunners, pushing the crossing work forward alongside his own crews and shovel parties, and as the gap opened, waving the tanks toward it. The men digging beside Patton were hit and went down. Patton stayed standing. Once the first tanks nosed across the gap, Patton had the thing he had been struggling to build in the ditch: a large body of men, tanks moving again, and a direction. Patton pointed the whole ragged formation at the German machine guns on the heights ahead and led it charging up the slope. This was the thing Patton had wanted since he was a boy, the thing he had always feared the war would end before granting him. Not managing a battle on a map, but standing on his own 2 feet, out at the very front, straight into the fire, leading a real charge. Around 150 men rose up out of the cover behind Patton and began charging up the hill into the fire. That hill cut them down. The machine gun fire raked the charge in the open ground, men fell along the slope, and within a few minutes, those 150 had been reduced to only a handful still standing and still moving. Patton was out in front when a bullet passed through the upper part of Patton's thigh, cutting into the leg and dropping Patton where he stood. The commander, who had ignored every order meant to keep him in the rear, went down on the bare hillside in the open, bleeding, inside the fire zone of the very machine guns he was charging. Even then, Patton did not give up the fight. An orderly named Joe Angelo made his way to Patton, dragged Patton into a shell hole, and stayed with him under fire, a feat that earned Angelo a medal and kept Patton alive on that hillside. In the shell hole, Patton was still bleeding, still unable to walk, but he went on giving orders, directing the tanks and the surviving soldiers to attack the German positions, refusing to be carried off until the fight in front of him had been handled. Patton disobeyed orders to go up to the front line, disobeyed orders to organize a charge out of stragglers, disobeyed orders to lead the charge, and was shot doing the thing his orders had expressly forbidden. And that same chain of defiance broke through a stretch of the German line at Cheppy. Only after the position had pushed forward again did Patton allow himself to be evacuated, carried back down the battlefield he had insisted on entering, to an aid station and a long recovery ahead. The wound was enough to end Patton's war. The armistice came while Patton was still recovering, on Patton's own 33rd birthday, close enough to the fighting to let him taste it, yet too late for him ever to return to the field. For that recklessness, Patton would receive the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest award for valor, and be promoted to full colonel. The written record of the United States Army would now carry, side by side, a formal reprimand for leaving his post, and a commendation for the courage Patton showed after he had left it. Please sit with what this really means, because here is the whole knot of it inside a single frame. That instinct which Rockenbach rebuked after the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, the one that became a standing order backed by the threat of a court-martial, is the very same instinct that carried Patton up the slope at Cheppy. Had Patton obeyed the order, Patton would have spent the whole morning in a command post receiving slow runners, seeing nothing, and that patched-together charge which took the position might never have formed at all. Because Patton disobeyed the order, the line moved forward, and Patton nearly died. The Army rebuked the cause and decorated the result, and the cause and the result were the same man doing the same forbidden thing. Any version of that medal, without exception, contains that act of disobedience. Rockenbach was left to deal with a contradiction that has no column to fill it in on any fitness report. Rockenbach was right, on principle of command, in his judgment of the behavior. A brigade commander bleeding in a shell crater a mile away is a brigade commander who is not commanding his brigade. Rockenbach issued the perfectly correct order, twice, and the officer who ignored that order, by that very same act, became the reason a collapsing attack turned into a captured position. Now there were two battles saying the same thing. The reprimand did not touch the impulse. The threat of a court-martial did not touch it either. A bullet through the thigh only confirmed in blood what the impulse could cost the man who carried it, and there was no sign at all that the cost would change anything. The citation that came with the Distinguished Service Cross praised the very behavior that the reprimand condemned. It describes an officer who, when his tanks were stopped, went forward on foot through heavy fire, gathered up a group of scattered soldiers, and led them in an attack on the enemy position until he fell wounded. Read as a citation, it's a portrait of model courage. But read alongside Rockenbach's 3 points of instruction, it's a checklist of the orders Patton broke, one by one, to earn that medal. The commander was supposed to hold his position. Patton went forward on foot instead. The commander was supposed to stay in contact with the corps. Patton cut that contact and walked a road swept by fire. No one was supposed to leave the tanks and fight on foot. Patton left everything behind and led borrowed infantry on foot, right up at the front. The same afternoon of fighting at Cheppy produced both of these documents. The Army could find no way to praise what Patton did without describing in the process exactly why Patton should have stood trial for it. The men who had been on that field kept a simpler account of it, one that doesn't so much contradict the citation as explain why the citation exists. The soldiers followed Patton up that slope, into machine gun fire, out of a hole most of them had every reason to stay inside, because Patton was standing in front of them and not hiding behind a map to the rear. That devotion wasn't something the Army handed to Patton. It was drawn out on the spot by the one specific act the Army had strictly forbidden. A commander who obeyed Rockenbach's order and directed the fight from the rear could never have launched that charge, because the thing that sparked the charge was the sight of the commander himself out in the open, leading from the front. Patton's hold over the troops and Patton's defiance of orders aren't two separate facts about the man. They're the same fact seen from two directions. This was the balance left to Rockenbach to strike, and Rockenbach was a very fine soldier who wouldn't make a dishonest judgment in either direction. Rockenbach couldn't pretend the result excused the means. It's possible for a commander to bleed in a crater up front, and it's also possible for the tank corps he commands to be a corps with a structural flaw at the top, and Rockenbach was right to note this in writing, twice. Rockenbach likewise couldn't pretend the means achieved nothing. Those means brought about the collapse of the German line, earned a Distinguished Service Cross, and built a brigade that would go through fire and water for the man. Rockenbach had done everything that command allowed. Rockenbach had reprimanded, had ordered, and had threatened, and had watched all three slide off that impulse without leaving a single mark. For anyone who studies command, here's the part that haunts you, and it has nothing to do with whether Patton was brave. His courage was never in question. What these two battles expose is that certain qualities can't be corrected without being destroyed, because the flaw and the gift come from the same place. Rockenbach could have broken Patton's habit of leading from the front. A court-martial after Cheppy would have done it. But the man who walked out the other side of that correction, safe and obedient in a command post, would no longer be the man who could pull 150 stragglers up off the ground and lead them into machine gun fire up a hill. To fix the flaw was to erase the very thing that made the officer worth keeping. Rockenbach didn't fail to solve the problem. Rockenbach faced a problem with no perfect solution and could only choose which loss to accept. Rockenbach chose the outcome that kept the officer. The reprimand stayed in the record, and so did the medal. Patton wasn't tried, wasn't shipped home, wasn't broken down in rank. Patton healed and became a colonel. And that instinct came through the war intact, through the wound, through the long recovery, through the 22 years of peace that followed, into a second and far larger war, where a much older Patton would once again be known for being out at the very front of the fire, and would once again be disciplined for the loose tongue and hot temper that came bundled with that daring. The First World War had thrown at that instinct everything an army could throw: letters, a standing order, the threat of trial, a bullet through the thigh. Not one thing moved it in the slightest. Rockenbach was entirely right in his judgment of the man, and changed him not at all. Both of those things are true at once, and neither cancels the other, and that's about as close to a conclusion as that situation can offer. Go back to that field telephone in the thick fog, the very spot Patton was ordered to hold on the morning of the 26th of September. Picture it working the way Rockenbach designed it. Patton stays at his post, takes reports from runners, moves the tanks over the wire, sees nothing of the fight at Cheppy, and can see only words written on paper an hour before. In that version, the order is obeyed, the doctrine is honored, and this commander of the American tank forces does exactly what a commander is supposed to do. In that version, the patched-together charge never forms, the stragglers stay in their holes. That stretch of German line at Cheppy isn't taken that morning by a colonel with a shovel and a wound in his leg, and no citation is ever written, because nothing worth citing ever happens. There's no crater, so the orderly Joe Angelo never has to crawl into it and shield a bleeding colonel under fire until the shooting eased off, and it was that single act that kept Patton alive to reach the next war. Every good thing and every terrible thing that happened on that slope hangs on Patton's disobedience. Everything Rockenbach ordered would come true, the position wouldn't be taken, and this man wouldn't nearly die taking it. This is the closed loop that the fog uncovers, and it's worth looking at whole because it shows that Rockenbach's rule wasn't foolish. It was right. It simply asked Patton to be a kind of man he simply wasn't. By this point, the thing is no longer only about tanks, and no longer only about that wet morning in the Argonne. A man will keep obeying the deepest thing inside him, even after every outside force meant to stop him has been used up. The reprimand, the standing order, the threat of ruin, and even the price the impulse itself makes him pay: the wound. Patton could see through this danger as clearly as Rockenbach could. Patton had helped draft the doctrine that pointed the danger out. Understanding the flaw does no good, because the flaw doesn't live in the part of Patton where he understands things. It hides deeper down, in the place where a man has already acted before he's finished reasoning, and a letter simply can't reach that deep. As it turned out, neither could a bullet. And so the record closes on these two documents, lying side by side in the same file folder, both true, both impossible to withdraw. One is the reprimand, in which Samuel Rockenbach wrote, in cold official words, that George Patton left his post and endangered the tank program of the United States, and the First World War never proved that judgment wrong. The other is the Distinguished Service Cross, meant to honor the courage Patton showed in that same action the reprimand condemned, on that same field the order forbade. The Army, on the same afternoon, filed this violation and this honor under the same name, and let them both stand in force. The instinct that won the first went on to win him just as much of both in the Second War, unchanged to the very end.